Nathaniel's breath was ragged. The clicking was everywhere. Maggie clutched the bloodied blade, staring at the towering figure in the dark, hollow eyes, twisted limbs, the stench of decay. Then, the ground trembled. There wasn't just one. She whispered, voice shaking, "We were never supposed to find this." The year was 1855. The forests of Bloodwood, Oregon, were no place for the faint of heart. Towering trees, their bark stained dark red as if soaked in old blood, loomed overhead. The thick canopy choked out most of the sunlight, leaving the ground in an eerie, permanent twilight. There were no birds singing, no rustling of small creatures. The silence was unnatural, a silence that devoured sound like an open grave. 3 figures trudged through the undergrowth, their boots crunching against damp, rotting leaves. They weren't just explorers, they were men and women with a purpose, though each had their own reasons for stepping into the place where the land itself seemed to whisper warnings. Leading the group was Nathaniel Carter, a hardened man whose body bore the scars of war and survival. He had fought in the Mexican-American War, where he had seen the horrors of battle firsthand. His hands were steady, his mind sharp, but his heart carried ghosts from past conflicts. Nathaniel wasn't here for fortune or glory. He had been hired by a land baron to map these cursed lands and ensure their safety for settlers. But deep inside, he knew this was about more than just money. Something was pulling him here, something that had gnawed at his dreams, whispering from the void of his memories. He didn't believe in legends. But he believed in the things men weren't meant to understand. Walking just behind Nathaniel, Ezekiel Zeke Holloway scribbled furiously in his leather-bound notebook. A historian and cartographer by trade, he had always been fascinated by the myths of the old world, tales of lost civilizations, forgotten wars, and creatures that didn't belong in the natural order. But he didn't come here to chase stories. No, Zeke was convinced that the war between settlers and something else was a fabrication, exaggerated by fear and superstition. He was here to debunk the rumors. Even as he stepped over a set of footprints too large to be human, too deep to be anything but monstrous, he smirked. "Bears," he muttered under his breath. "Just bears." He was dead wrong. Maggie Holloway, Zeke's younger sister, wasn't as easily convinced as her brother. She didn't have a scholar's arrogance, but she did have a survivor's instinct, one that had kept her alive through situations that should have killed her. From the moment they set foot in Bloodwood, Maggie felt it. A presence. A weight in the air that pressed against her lungs, made the back of her neck prickle. It wasn't paranoia. She had hunted enough in the wilderness to know when she was being watched. And here, in this forsaken place, they were not alone. Unseen, lurking beyond the treeline, something huge and unnatural shifted in the shadows. It moved without sound, without disturbing the undergrowth. It had been waiting. Waiting for the intruders. Waiting for the war to begin again. The Bloodwood beast, the last of its kind, was no simple creature. It was ancient. It was intelligent. And it was vengeful. The group pressed forward, unaware that they had already crossed the threshold into something far older than the world they knew. Their fate had already been sealed. Something was coming for them. And this time, it would leave no survivors. The deeper they went into Bloodwood Forest, the more unnatural everything felt. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence in itself, pressing down on them, thick and heavy. The scent of damp earth mixed with something else, something foul, like meat left out in the sun for too long. Nathaniel halted abruptly, his hand raised in a silent command. Zeke nearly bumped into him, too busy scribbling in his notebook to notice the sudden tension in the air. Maggie, ever watchful, gripped the hilt of her knife, her eyes scanning the treeline. And then they saw it. A footprint. Not a bear's. Not a man's. Something else. The print was massive, easily twice the size of Nathaniel's boot, pressed deep into the soil as if something impossibly heavy had stood there, just moments ago. It had 5 distinct toes, clawed and unnervingly human-like. Zeke laughed nervously, shaking his head. "A trick of the mud," he muttered, crouching to take a closer look. "Erosion, maybe." The rain distorts. A branch snapped in the distance. Not from the wind. Something was moving. Maggie's breath hitched. She wasn't just imagining it anymore. They were being hunted. Nathaniel's grip tightened on his rifle. His soldier's instincts screamed at him, they needed to leave. Then, from the depths of the forest, came a sound that did not belong to this world. Not a growl. Not a roar. A deep, guttural clicking, like bones grinding together, like something speaking a language no human was meant to understand. And it was close. Too close. Nathaniel led the way with cautious steps, his rifle raised, eyes scanning every shadow. The sound, the unnatural clicking, had stopped, but the forest had not returned to silence. Now, there was something worse, a faint, wet breathing, as if something enormous was just beyond sight, inhaling their scent. Then, they stumbled upon it. A clearing, silent and wrong, where the trees stood unnaturally still. But what lay at the center was what made Maggie's stomach turn. An old, abandoned settlement. The remains of wooden cabins, long since collapsed, were strewn across the clearing. Deep claw marks ran along the walls, jagged and brutal. Bones, some human, some too large to be human at all, lay scattered, their surfaces gnawed and cracked open, as if something had sucked the marrow from within. Zeke, usually eager to dismiss anything supernatural, swallowed hard. No, this doesn't make sense. He knelt, running his fingers over a broken skull. The fracture was clean, precise, like something had crushed it with one swift motion. Nathaniel scanned the scene, his jaw tightening. He had seen slaughter before, but this was a purge. Then, Maggie found something that made her blood run cold. A stone carving, half buried in the dirt, covered in ancient etchings. The image was unmistakable, a towering figure with elongated limbs and hollow, burning eyes. Beneath it, words scrawled in a language none of them understood. But Nathaniel didn't need a translation. This was a warning. And they were already too deep to turn back. The air had changed. The forest no longer felt merely ominous, it felt alive, as if the trees themselves held their breath, waiting. The ground beneath them, damp and uneven, seemed to tremble ever so slightly, as if something massive was stirring beneath the earth. Nathaniel's grip on his rifle was firm, but his hands were clammy. He had faced death before, but never like this. "We shouldn't be here," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. Then came the first sign. A distant thud. Rhythmic. Heavy. Something walking, something big. Zeke turned sharply, panic flashing in his eyes. Maybe it's just an echo. Snap. The sound of a massive branch breaking directly behind them. Nathaniel spun around, rifle raised. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. There, just past the tree line, something shifted, a hulking mass, too large, too silent for something so impossibly big. Two glowing eyes stared back at them. Then, it moved. The beast didn't charge, didn't roar. Instead, it stalked forward slowly, deliberately, like a predator playing with its prey. Zeke was the first to break. In sheer terror, he turned to run. And that was when it attacked. A blur of movement. A monstrous arm lashed out from the darkness, its claws catching Zeke mid-stride. A sickening, wet tear filled the night. His scream was cut short. Maggie and Nathaniel stood frozen as something dragged Zeke's lifeless body into the trees, the sound of snapping bones echoing long after he was gone. A moment of pure, deafening silence. Then, the clicking returned. But this time, it was everywhere. Nathaniel grabbed Maggie's arm. "We need to move. Now." And as they ran, the hunt had only just begun. Maggie and Nathaniel ran blindly through the darkness, lungs burning, feet pounding against the damp earth. The clicking sounds followed, growing louder, multiplying, as if the beast wasn't alone. Nathaniel's military instincts screamed at him, they weren't just being hunted, they were being herded. The trees blurred past them, the forest an endless maze of shadows and twisted roots. Maggie's breath came in short gasps, her body begging for rest, but there was no stopping now. Then, the ground beneath her gave way. She tumbled forward, plunging into a steep ravine, rolling down jagged rocks until she landed with a bone-rattling crash. Nathaniel's voice echoed behind her, but when she looked up, he wasn't there. Only silence. Then, a whisper on the wind. Low. Guttural. Unhuman. She wasn't alone. Maggie's hand closed around a rusted blade buried in the dirt beside her, a relic, perhaps, from the last war fought here. A war that had never truly ended. And now, it was her turn to fight. Maggie lay still, her fingers tightening around the rusted blade. The air in the ravine was suffocatingly still. Somewhere above, she could hear Nathaniel shouting, but his voice was fading. Something else was down here with her. A shape moved in the shadows, tall, grotesque, watching. Its breathing was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Maggie's pulse thundered in her ears. No running this time. She shifted her grip on the blade and forced herself to stand. If this was where she was going to die, she wasn't going without a fight. Then, the clicking stopped. The beast tilted its head, almost curious. Maggie took a cautious step back, her heel struck something hard. She turned for a split second, bones. Dozens of them. Not just old skeletons. Fresh ones. She had found something she wasn't meant to see. Something they had tried to keep buried. And now, they weren't going to let her leave. Maggie's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the pile of bones, her mind racing. How many had died here before her? How many had stumbled into the war that was never meant to be remembered? The creature didn't move, not yet. It simply watched, its massive frame blending with the darkness, its hollow eyes locked onto her. It wasn't just hunting. It was waiting. Nathaniel's voice shouted from above, but the sound was distant, as if the forest itself was swallowing him whole. Maggie's grip tightened on the rusted blade. There was only one way out. She lunged. The blade sank deep into flesh, and for the first time, the beast screamed. Not a roar of pain, but of rage. The ground shook beneath her feet. The trees above groaned as if the entire forest was reacting. The truth hit her like a hammer. This thing was not alone. The clicking sounds returned, this time all around her. As the darkness closed in, Maggie finally understood. This wasn't just a legend. This wasn't just a monster. This was a warning. And the war was far from over.